Vulnerability can be necessary and beautiful in certain contexts. When we choose it, like opening up to someone we trust or trying something new. And here, vulnerability helps us to grow, connect, and become more fully engaged in our lives and what we're doing. But not all vulnerability is chosen. Sometimes it just happens, especially when we're young, powerless, or feeling overwhelmed. And when we feel exposed in that way, we can instinctively try to protect ourselves. In my work with gender identity, I've seen how this kind of vulnerability, unwanted and unmanaged, can often be at the root of gender dysphoria. Welcome to the Metaphor of Gender. I'm Sasha, a therapist, and this channel is for curious people who prefer deep thinking over dogma. We explore identity, meaning, and how to live life well. So far in this Hidden Roots series, we've explored 6 different factors that can shape gender dysphoria, many of which you'll notice involve vulnerability. In this final video, we'll take a closer look at how vulnerability itself plays a direct role, using some familiar examples and some brand new ones. And remember, this often isn't conscious. People don't usually think, if I identify differently, then I'll feel safer. We're human. We're not hyper-rational robots, luckily. So our behaviors often carry meaning that we may not fully understand until we pause and look more closely. Okay, first up, sexual vulnerability. Anytime a person has felt intimidated, scared, or pressured related to sex or intimacy, we could say they have felt sexually vulnerable. And since everyone is different, what might feel really frightening and intimidating to one person may not really bother another person at all. So a range of things, from unwanted sexual comments, teasing, or jokes, all the way to physical assaults, abuse, or even sexual violence will of course be experienced as sexual vulnerability. Now, this can lead to shameful feelings about your body, your genitals, or your sex characteristics. Even seeing deeply disturbing pornography could make someone feel sexually vulnerable and uncomfortable with their own body. And all of this can grow into gender dysphoria. There's another kind of sexual vulnerability that I rarely hear people talking about. I call it toxic by default vulnerability. This happens when a person is misunderstood as predatory, creepy, or dangerous. Sometimes natural, healthy sexual feelings and desires are criticized or demonized or treated as toxic, and nobody wants to be seen as a monster or a threat to others. Unfortunately, this is pretty common, especially for boys and young men, though it can happen to girls as well. For example, tools like these tell us that toxic masculinity, things like caring about strength, valuing emotional stoicism, or showing any aggression during a conflict, are just a few steps away from sexual violence, stalking, or murder. What? What do these ideas communicate to a young man who's starting to feel very strong sexual attractions or big emotions during adolescence? The truth is, going through puberty, for both boys and girls, is a complete roller coaster of unpredictable feelings, thoughts, emotions, and experience. Now, while it is crucial for young men to learn how to channel their strong feelings in healthy and respectful ways, it's also completely unfair to shame them simply for having those feelings in the first place. So if a young man starts to interpret his very maleness as toxic, this can lead to gender dysphoria and the fear of further masculinizing into adulthood. Next up, anyone who's an outsider can experience vulnerability. Now, especially if your environment is hostile, being in the statistical minority can be difficult. If you've ever thought, hey, I stick out like a sore thumb here, then first of all, congratulations, you used a metaphor, but also you know exactly what I'm talking about. Whether you're an ethnic or racial minority, or perhaps a kid from a working class family going to a really expensive private school on scholarship, or someone who's just a little quirky and eccentric compared to the people in your family or workplace, you can feel self-conscious and a little bit vulnerable. A lot of trans content these days is like, I always knew I felt different, and now I know why. So if you go down that pathway of research, it could lead someone with outsider vulnerability to question their gender identity and develop gender dysphoria. Next up, privilege vulnerability. Look, I know this sounds like an oxymoron, but this is actually quite common. Here's how it happens. A lot of good people care about fairness and want to do the right thing. So if you're really principled, compassionate, and justice-oriented, you might come to recognize your own privilege or ways that you might have gotten a leg up in life. But this realization has to be managed very carefully. On one hand, you can become more appreciative and grateful for your privilege. You can engage in service to uplift others and give back in a meaningful way. But if you look at your privilege through the wrong lens, it can lead to feelings of shame and vulnerability, which frankly don't help anyone. For example, when models like this are interpreted without enough nuance, they end up framing things like power, oppression, and privilege as some sort of hierarchy full of victims and offenders. Looking at this oppression matrix could make people feel quite bad about themselves. Maybe a white person doesn't want to be seen as a privileged oppressor in a system of racist oppression. In social justice groups, centering marginalized voices sometimes means that people of privileged groups don't get to share their input and have to take a backseat to others based on their identities. I think people will react to this sort of exclusion either with anger and defensiveness or by self-deprecation, shame, and making themselves smaller. Some will even reject parts of themselves that are considered privileged and seek to identify with a more marginalized group and identity. Next, we have false self-vulnerability. Look at this post. I feel really sad for this young person. A fan, a biological female, is avoiding femininity, even though that's not exactly what they want, in order to make people respond a certain way. Why are you working so hard to put your stated identity of a gender before everything else? I covered this more closely in a video about breaking the gender binary. The truth is, genuinely accepting ourselves sometimes feels really hard to do. Many of the young women that I've worked with are very sensitive. And what I mean by this is that they have deep feelers. They pick up on mood shifts, they absorb comments, and react intensely to subtle social cues around them. But there's little cultural praise for having strong emotions, so they often see these qualities as a sign of weakness, especially if they're identifying as transmasculine or trans men and don't think that sensitivity fits into that gender presentation. One young woman told me she felt that modern feminism expects women to be emotionally detached and unbothered, especially around things like relationships and sex. But she valued things like commitment and care and felt ashamed for it. Now, of course, not all young women feel this way or want those things. And some gay, lesbian, or bisexual teens feel a similar pressure to hide parts of who they are, creating their own version of a false self. This mismatch between our authentic self and who we're trying to portray to the world can lead to feelings of incongruence and gender incongruence too. Finally, there's family role vulnerability. And look, every family has flaws, but some environments are more dysfunctional than others. Sometimes the relationship between parents lacks respect or balance, and a child watching this might learn, hey, this is how men get treated, and this is how women get treated. That message can also extend to siblings if a child sees that their brother or sister is being treated very differently based on their sex. These dynamics can plant an early seed of discomfort with one's gender role. And this goes both ways. Depending on the family roles, girls might envy the freedom given to boys, and boys might wish for the gentler treatment that their sisters are receiving. But there are other ways this can look. Parents might consciously or unconsciously favor one sex or even pressure a child towards a particular gender role. A father may really want his daughter to be a tomboy and encourage her in more masculine preferences. Or a mother who had wished she had a daughter may dress up her son in girls' clothing as a young child. All of these different cues can shape how kids relate to their own sense of identity. Now, even in same-sex parent households, kids can associate certain roles with their parents and then develop fantasies or fixations around the parent role that they don't see represented at home. And in homes with betrayal, substance abuse, or major power imbalances, children are in extremely vulnerable situations with powerful messages about sex, gender, and the roles we play in the family. In general, when we feel overwhelmed and powerless, our minds sometimes latch on to something active, something we can control. Gender identity can sometimes become that focus. It can be part distraction and part an attempt to regain a sense of mastery over our inner world. So, tell me below in the comments, have you experienced vulnerability in any of the ways I described today? Have you ever felt ashamed of your natural desires because they betray some political ideal about what's right or wrong? I read all the comments and I love to hear from you guys. All right, that's it for today. Keeping one foot in reality and one in possibility. I'll see you next time. And if you want to keep learning about the hidden roots of gender dysphoria, click here. This information is meant for educational purposes only and not as a substitute for mental health services.